This is Bill O'Hanlon, and I wanted to talk to you today about cha-cha-cha changes. That comes from the David Bowie song, The Three Ways to Change Problem Patterns in Therapy. I was influenced a great deal by Milton Erickson. I studied with him directly in the 1970s. And before that, I was studying MRI, brief therapy approaches, family therapy, and systemic approaches, Jay Haley's approaches. And I was greatly influenced by those. But before I even found those approaches, I was influenced by the work of Carl Rogers, who really stressed that in order for people to trust in the therapy process, to connect with the therapist, there has to initially be a communication of acceptance. And so for me, the precursor to the change process is really listening very deeply and very carefully to people, not invalidating them, not pushing them too fast before you understand and accept them. And the brief therapist, John Weakland, who worked at the MRI and was one of the developers of the model, once told me, if you want to do brief therapy, the first rule is to go slowly. And I like not only that saying for the irony of it, but also because I think it's true. If you're going to do brief therapy, you have to be a little better at connecting with people and listening to people. And the first step in this change process, before you actually start to do anything to create change, is, I guess, what I would call it the acceptance and validation piece. That you need to be really good about listening, being curious, and be careful of thinking you understand too quickly, really getting and understanding and accepting and validating the person where they are. Not saying that they're correct in all their ideas or their behaviors, but not giving them a sense that they're being judged or that they're crazy or wrong or bad, incorrect in their perceptions or their experience. So there's a lot of ways to do this, but obviously listening carefully is one of them. Carl Rogers had this idea of just feeding back to them, repeating back to them either the emotions behind what they're saying, the feelings behind what they're saying, or just their perceptions. Now, I have a way of doing this that I call Carl Rogers with a twist, which is it sort of prepares the ground for not only acceptance, but change. And we can talk about that a little more detail, but the main thing I do is sort of a verbal acceptance while placing a seed of change or possibility in there. So perhaps if the person says, I'm depressed, I might, when I reflect what they say as part of the acceptance, is just say, so you've been depressed. Because in my view, in my sense of things in therapy, there's always a possibility of change in every moment. So I'd rather not bring depression into the present or the problem into the present. And one of the simple ways to do that is when you're reflecting and when you're joining with the person and validating the person, you add just a little sense of possibility in there. So putting in the past tense is one of the ways. Another way I do it is when they talk and act as if there's a generalization, I'm always this way, or it's never going to change. I try to put in, when I reflect, just a little possibility, and that usually it's this way, typically it's this way, it's almost always been this way. Rarely do you feel this way. So I change the language a little to make it a little more possibility laden while I'm doing this acceptance and validation. And if the person feels like you're being too optimistic or you don't understand their problem, then you're doing it incorrectly because they're feeling invalidated or not understood. So you have to be very artful in doing this. But to me, the rest of what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation is probably not going to work unless the person feels understood, heard, validated, listened to, and that they don't feel judged or pushed along too quickly. So given that as the background, we're going to be talking about 3 ways to change problem patterns, to help people move on from whatever brought them to therapy for change. Now, in order to do that, I want to talk first of something that when I worked with Milton Erickson, it seemed he understood this, but the science wasn't here yet. But he died many years ago. He died in 1980, sorry. And the science at that time believed that the brain was fixed once you went past adolescence, probably mostly in childhood. The brain is very changeable, plastic they call it. But afterwards, it pretty much, you have as many brain cells as you're going to have. They can die off, they can be damaged, but basically you're not going to grow any new brain cells. And that learning really doesn't take place. You develop a lot of habits in adolescence, a lot of personality traits in adolescence that are probably not going to change. And that was the idea. The brain was pretty much fixed by the time you were a young adult, late adolescence. Well, that doesn't hold anymore. There's been a lot of research, and it's very clear now that what I was taught when I was learning in neurological psychology training, that the brain was fixed, is not right. The brain is plastic all through life. A little less plastic as we go along through life, as our bodies become a little less flexible and our brains become a little less flexible. But there are things you can do to make it more flexible and more plastic. But there's good news and the bad news about brain plasticity. That is that all through life, we can learn and make new connections and grow new brain cells, except under a few conditions. When you're under extreme stress, when there's been brain damage, you can lose some brain cells, or the brain cells can stop growing if there's some sort of inflammation or disease process or a lot of stress. But for the most part, our brains are continually making new brain cells and making new connections. And that's the good news. But the bad news is that the brain is pretty efficient. That is, once we learn something and we develop it as a habit, it wires into our brain as a sort of a groove, or as a channel, as a habit, and the brain circuits get stronger, the more you do something. I saw a guitarist who developed dementia in the end of his life, Glenn Campbell, and he could still play guitar amazingly because those brain circuits were so strong that even when the rest of his brain was deteriorating, he could still play guitar very, very well. So the habits are really strong. When I go to visit Great Britain, I live in the United States. When I go to visit Great Britain, they have signs on the pavement in the road saying, look right instead of look left, because a lot of American tourists or people who come from countries where the cars drive on the other side of the road will step out in front of a car or a bus or a trolley or a lorry, and they'll get hit because they're so used to looking one way to look for the traffic. The brain gets very grooved and it gets into habits. So what happens is it takes a little effort, a lot of effort sometimes, to go out of the groove, to change that. The good news is we can do it any time in life. The bad news is we typically don't. I don't know if you've ever done this, but I used to drive to work the same way every day. And one time when it wasn't a work day, I drove close to where my work was and I automatically pulled into the parking lot for my work because my brain was just in that pattern. So it takes a little effort, sometimes some great effort to change the pattern. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So the brain is patterned. The body is patterned. The muscles are patterned. Our language is patterned. When you go to a different country, it's challenging because you're falling back on your default language. And, there's an American comedian, Steve Martin, who said, I went to France recently. He said, those French have a different word for everything. And I think that speaks to this pattern thing. You tend to fall back on your old patterns, in the classic story of the ugly American tourist, the ugly German tourist. Both of us have terrible reputations internationally, is you just say it in your language louder to the person that doesn't speak your language. So we tend to fall into patterns. So what we're going to be talking about here next are 3 ways to change patterns, 3 places and 3 ways to change patterns, which again, we know the brain is capable of, we know human beings are capable of, but it doesn't always happen easily or automatically. So we're going to talk about these 3 places to change patterns. So the first precursor to change I talked about, of course, was that a deep acceptance, listening, curiosity, really making a good connection with the person. But once we do the change process, there are going to be three ways. So I've labeled this one number 2. And in English, two of these are going to rhyme. So I know some of you don't speak English as your first language, so that you may lose the rhyme here. But the first, I'll just tell you what they are. Change the doing, change the viewing, and change the context. So let's talk about changing the doing first. One way we get patterned is in our actions and in our interactions. This is the whole basis of systemic therapies, that we're thinking of people being in systems where somebody does something, another person responds to that, that other person responds to the response, and we get into a pattern interpersonally as well as personally. So traditional psychology, traditional therapy was very individually oriented, said it's the person, their personality, their historical background, their genetics, their biochemistry, and yes, certainly all those are patterned, can be patterned. But there's also an interactional pattern that pulls forth or draws forth certain things, and that we get into patterns with other people and patterns and environments, and we'll talk about that. And then ways of speaking. So to me, the doing has to do with what patterns repeat over and over again, related to the problem that the person has come to therapy for, of actions, interactions, and talk and language, speaking. And there are two ways to make changes in this. And the first one, that when the MRI approach came out, they didn't really pay attention too much, because they thought all you need to do is change the pattern of what people are doing because it's not working. But Steve DeShazer, I was one of these people that came along and said, and Erickson was one of the people that came along and said, yeah, but sometimes people are doing things that are working, but they're not recognizing that. They're not using some of those resources and abilities they have. So the first place I learned to look when I studied with Dr. Erickson, who was always looking for what's worked and finding out what the person has as a resource in that area. What actions, interactions, and ways of speaking do they have that are helpful? And then encourage them to do more of that. So there are really two ways to approach making these changes, changing the doing, changing the viewing, and changing the context. One is figure out what's worked in other contexts, or in this context occasionally, and then have people do more of what's worked. So that's the solution-based approach, solution-oriented approach, solution-focused approach, strength-based approach, sometimes it's called. And the second thing is to change the pattern, and this is more in the MRI modality, and Milton Erickson did it too, and a lot of systemic therapies and most therapies encourage people to do something different in this area. So what we're looking for is to change the pattern, break up the pattern of what's not working by doing something different in the realm of action, interactions, or language. And what I learned from Dr. Erickson is sometimes to make the smallest changes. I used to work with people who would be doing eating disorders, anorexia or bulimia, mostly bulimia, and or people who just didn't like the way they ate and they were overweight. And I used to suggest a very small change. If they were right-handed, I would have them eat with their left hand anytime they were eating in a way that wasn't so great, or just switch to their left hand for a certain period, for a week or for a day or something like that. That is a really small change. And if you ask a person, stop binging and vomiting, that would be really hard for them to do. But if you ask them to make this small change, or eat in a different area of the house, which gets into changing the context too, but just change where you do this thing, change how you do this thing, and find the smallest change that you can possibly make. Now, sometimes I help them make dramatic and bigger changes, but I found that this way of changing the doing is probably the easiest way to do it, because almost everybody can change some small thing about what they do. And if they say, I can't change, I can't eat with my left hand, I just can't do it, you could find something else. You could tell them to change into different clothes while they eat. You could tell them to eat naked. Anything that would be a change in their behavior And again, I used to work with women mostly who had trouble with eating and trouble with weight. And they would come in to see me and they would say, "Oh, I was really good this week," or "I was really bad this week." And I would stop them and I would say, "Sorry, I'm a therapist and I'm really sensitive to this. I think that a lot of women get in trouble because they judge themselves on both their behavior and on their weight. So how about if we just do an experiment?" And when you're talking about eating, your eating behavior, you don't use the words good or bad, which are kind of judgment words and value words. Instead, just use the words, "I ate the way I thought I should eat," or "I didn't eat the way I thought I should eat," rather than that you were good or bad. Kind of that judgment word isn't so helpful. And the first few times they would come in afterwards and they would say, "I was really bad. I didn't eat the way I thought I should eat this week." And it would take them a little while to change that pattern, but they would come back and tell me, "I'm feeling less ashamed of myself and less judgmental about myself." And I had the idea, and so did they often, that it was because they changed how they were speaking about the problem. So this changing the doing is either finding what works in actions, interactions, or languaging, how you speak about things, or finding out what doesn't work and making some small or dramatic changes in those areas. Now, the second way to make change after you've validated the person, changed the doing, you might experiment with change the doing, is you could change the viewing. And what I mean by changing the viewing is change what you pay attention to, what you're focused on, what you're aware of, what you're attending to, as well as change the meanings that you have about this. Now, I often because again, I was influenced by Milton Erickson. When I was trained as a therapist, I never learned anything about storytelling, but I found it a really effective way of helping people change the viewing, what they're paying attention to, or what meaning they're making of things. So sometimes I'll get a person that will come in and they'll be talking about anxiety or phobias or something like that. And I'll tell them the story that I read in a book many years ago. It was the story of the Room of 1,000 Demons, in which it was a Tibetan enlightenment ceremony in which the Tibetan students who were studying to become enlightened were there with the lamas and the Dalai Lama. And they said, usually in order to become enlightened, the lamas would tell the students, you have to go through a lifetime of meditation and learning and practicing and, just doing lots of stuff. And it's going to take years. But once every 100 years, we have this special ceremony. And it's called the ceremony of the Room of 1,000 Demons. And so they say this ceremony isn't for everybody because it's challenging to go through. But there's a room that you can walk into that holds 1,000 demons. When you walk in the room, those demons have the ability to take from your own heart and your own mind and your own life your biggest fears, and they seem to make them real. So if you have a fear of heights, as soon as you walk into the Room of 1,000 Demons, you're going to be seeing a scene, and it will seem real to you, as if you're standing on the small ledge of a tall building. And if you take a step forward, you're going to die. Now, what we'll tell you is that what the demons show you, they take from your own mind, is not really real. It's an illusion. But most people who walk in the room can't see through the illusion, and they get paralyzed with fright. And here's the rules. We can't come into the room and save you. You have to make it out under your own steam. You can't go back out the door you came in because the door doesn't have a handle on it. You have to walk through the Room of 1,000 Demons. And as you walk through, you're going to be seeing your biggest fears. You're going to be experiencing your biggest fears. If your biggest fear is of being abandoned by the person who loves you, then you're going to see that scene. If your biggest fear is of spiders, you're going to see spiders. Whatever your fears are, whatever creates anxiety and fear for you is going to show up because these demons have the ability to take the images from your own mind and the fears from your own heart. And so we can't come in and get you. But, so if you want to go home now, fine, don't worry about it. You can do it the regular way, just meditate and study. But if you want to go through this ceremony, You'll have your own room of 1,000 demons. Each person has his or her own room. And we have 2 hints for you. One hint is whatever you see or feel or hear or think you know, it's just an illusion and it's not real. But most people who walked in the room couldn't remember that because it seems as real as this reality we're in. So that wasn't so helpful but a few people were able to remember that. The more helpful hint that people were able to use who made it out of the room of 1,000 demons the last time we held this ceremony was, no matter what you see, no matter what you think, no matter what you feel, keep your feet moving. Because if you keep your feet moving, you'll make it to the other side and you'll get out of the room with your fears. And that's enlightenment. So I tell that story every once in a while in therapy, and I've had my clients come back the next week or a couple of weeks later and say, I had a really rough week, but I kept my feet moving and I'm in a better place. So just telling that story differently from giving a lecture or giving an intellectual instructional process touches some people, not everybody obviously, touches some people in a way that really makes a change. So what I'm trying to do is both tell stories and when I'm changing the viewing, and also edit the stories that come in. Now again, those of you who know the MRI brief therapy model with framing interventions or Ericksonian work or other kinds of schema change things, cognitive approaches, may recognize this, that what I'm trying to do is give a new frame for the story that they're telling themselves. So we're going to edit the story for them. We're going to have them think about, how great it is to get rejected if they ask somebody out for a date, because they're learning to deal with rejection and becoming stronger. And that's a reframing of the same event. They had one interpretation, you're going to offer another interpretation. And again, I often do this through storytelling. Sometimes I just do it by offering the new interpretation. In addition, I'm going to invite them to deframe. So what I mean by that is just create some doubt on their current frame of reference. So they're not so certain that that's the only way to think about it or that's the only thing to pay attention to. So I remember a case in which a woman, it was like 2 minutes before the end of the session, announced out of the blue, just no warning about this, to her husband, well, all I can say is, if you go on that trip you're planning on this weekend, I'm going to divorce you. Now, she never said anything about this during the session. She got up, walked out of the room, and slammed the door out of the therapy room. And she was on her way out, and I just ran to the door, and as she was walking down the hall, I just said, are you sure about that? And she came back the next week and said, you really messed me up when you said that, because I wasn't sure. When I walked out of the room, I was sure I was going to get a divorce if he went on the trip. And he had already planned the trip and it was, scheduled and everything. And she said, but that created the seed of the doubt that maybe this wasn't a good idea and that I should rethink this. And so she came back for therapy the next week. That was the quickest example I can tell you of deframing. I didn't give her a new frame of reference. I just challenged the old one. So again, we're going back to this changing the pattern thing. And the changing the pattern means challenge the old one, and you can either offer a new one, or you can challenge the old one and just dissolve it in some way, but not offer a new one. Let them find a new one. Now, again, same kind of thing that we talked about in changing the doing. I want to find what works about stories and where they're paying attention, their interpretations of things, and I want to find what doesn't work. And the places you want to find when it doesn't work, that's when you want to use reframing and deframing. Okay, so on to the last bit here. We're getting close to the end of this presentation, and that is the third way to change the patterns. Now, again, remember the first way is to validate, just create the context for change by validating and listening and joining with the person, not judging them, making sure they know they're understood. Then changing the doing. Second thing, change the viewing. The third thing is to change the context. And the context, what I mean by that is anything that's part of the background of the surrounding situation that's not directly involved with the problem. So these are neurological things, family backgrounds, cultural learnings and backgrounds and orientations, gender backgrounds and gender orientations, physical locations and settings, spiritual practices, beliefs and backgrounds, all these things that don't necessarily have anything to do directly with the problem, but they're things that are related to it in some way. They're part of the background, they're part of the context of it. And what I'm trying to do is to find what I've talked about before in this change process, what I would call the wind in the sails and the holes in the bottom of the boat. So let me give you an example of this. And that is, my background is Irish, and my family came originally from Ireland. They came to the United States from Ireland. And I've noticed in my cultural background, I've been to visit Ireland, that there's some problem that Irish people often have, not all of them obviously, but often have with alcohol. That is, a lot of the people in my family background had deep troubles with alcohol, drank themselves to death, or ruined marriages or ruined careers because they drank too much. So that part of the holes in the bottom of my boat, because I came from the same background, and either it's genetic thing or it's a learned thing from my family or it's a modeled thing that I see that came from my family, is I've got to be careful about alcohol or drugs perhaps. And I've got to be careful about falling prey to alcohol problems. That's the holes in the bottom of the boat that could sink a person in their life. And then there's also the winds in the sails. When I went to Ireland, I was really amazed that so many people use music, storytelling, poetry. They were just artists. And that's often how they made meaning in life and how they made a good life. And so I thought, well, that's the wind in the sails for the Irish. We're really good at using storytelling and music and poetry to make a life and to create a successful life and to have a career. Even if we're in another career, maybe we're a lawyer or something like that, we use language in this amazing way. So language abilities, artistic abilities, those are the winds in the sails of my family background, my cultural background. So there's things that being a male is the holes in the bottom of my boat. And there are things that are the wind in my sails, that having testosterone makes me more confident and more action-oriented, but it also makes me more impulsive, perhaps more certain when I shouldn't be certain, maybe a little too aggressive sometimes. So there are things in my background, and what I'm trying to do with the context is just what I was talking about with the other two change areas, and that is finding what works and doing more of that. Finding what doesn't work, the holes in the bottom of the boat, and challenging that by de-patterning when you're doing the pattern intervention with doing, viewing, or context, or repatterning by offering a new pattern, a new possibility, or re-evoking a pattern that I've had somewhere else in another context or some other time in my life. And that's the whole solution-oriented approach. So I want to call this to an end. I didn't want to make anything revolutionary here. I think you probably knew what I said in this presentation, but hopefully now you have a new way of thinking about it, maybe a new frame of reference for it, or it's just a little clearer. So let me just go over what we talked about just to summarize it quickly. The first thing before you do any change work, and this could be in the first 2 minutes, it doesn't have to take a long time, or it could be in the first 2 sessions, is validate the person, join with them, make sure they feel heard and understood and not judged and not pushed. And if they feel misunderstood or judged or pushed in any way, they'll probably resist whatever the next thing that you do is. But once that process of validation is complete or in pretty good shape, I move very, very quickly. And again, I have this background in brief therapy like many of you listening to this do. I want to find out where can we make changes in the doing, the viewing, and the context. 2 kinds of changes we're going to make. One is we're going to de-pattern what used to not work. The other is to repattern. And repatterning may be involved with offering new frames of reference, new actions, new interactions, new ways of speaking about things, new ways of holding the context. Or rediscovering, and this is the solution-based approach, solution-oriented, solution-focused approach, what has worked in the past and putting it in place in the problem area. So that's my idea of organizing. A lot of what you're going to hear during this conference actually will fall into one of these frames of reference. Some people will focus on the doing more, the languaging of it more. Some people focus on reframing and the viewing of it. Some people focus on context, people who think about gender politics and family history and family context. They're going to be thinking about context, spiritual approaches or religious approaches, and how much they might influence what people are doing. Those are going to be in the context. So hopefully this will give you a way to hold and think about everything else that you hear during this whole conference. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and thank you very much.